So I'm going to talk about a data set we collected through the RECWI project, as Steve was mentioning, and it was collected not as a study of poverty, but as a health and social outcomes survey of injured workers with permanent impairments. And because we had the information in questions in the survey that allowed us to estimate poverty using a couple of indicators that I'll describe here, we were able to calculate a poverty coefficient for each of the participants in the study, and that's what I'm presenting here. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. Becky Casey, this presentation is published recently in an academic journal called Critical Public Health. We thought it was an appropriate topic for a public health audience, and so you can get the paper and read the details. But my co-authors are Becky Casey, who's here in the audience, Fergal O'Hagan, my colleague at Trent University, but importantly, Pat Vino, who's an injured worker activist who's been involved and helped develop this survey and has been my collaborator with the survey from the beginning. And it was Pat who absolutely emphasized that injured worker poverty is a really serious issue and that we should try to study it. And I wasn't thinking about poverty initially, or I might have collected a little bit of data that I don't have. So we did the best we could with the data at hand. And you'll see, and we'll talk about some of its limitations. All data sets have limitations. This is not from our survey, but I found this just this week on the website of Poverty Free Ontario, an Ontario activist group focusing on and making political the issues of the growing and sustained and growing rates of poverty in the general population. And what you see on this slide is a graph that hovers, a line that hovers around 10% and climbing. That is the rate of poverty for people in Ontario from 1976 to 2009. So in 1976, there are official rates of documented poverty of 10.5% in Ontario. In 2009, at the end of the other end of the line on this graph, it's 13.1%. And that's poverty in families. Family poverty. And so the graph actually makes reference to the idea of structural poverty. That poverty occurs as a feature of an economic system in which there's a proportion, and this graph suggests maybe a growing proportion of people who have marginal attachments to income earning potential and therefore are living in poverty. And I think that's a really important point to start with, that there, and Emil's alluded to this a little bit, that there's poverty already among some people in the labor market, even as Poverty Free Ontario suggests, even people fully, in other words, full-time employed in the labor market. If you're living on minimum wage right now in Ontario at a full-time rate of work, hourly income, you are living under the poverty line, and that would depend and push you further toward deep poverty if you have a larger family and you have other precarious or unemployed people in that family. So we recognize, and this study is based out of our recognition, that poverty is pernicious. It's continued, if not growing, in Canada and Ontario. And disability, in every single poverty report written, disability is a major risk factor for being in poverty or in deep poverty. And so, using the language, the Worker Compensation Board doesn't talk about disabled claimants, it talks about permanently impaired claimants, but in our database of permanently impaired injured workers, we don't really make much distinction between whether they're permanently impaired or disabled. And so our thought was, and Pat's thought was, that if there's higher rates of poverty among people with disabilities, then surely we would see that in the database of our sample of permanently impaired injured workers. So we set out to ask the question, how prevalent is poverty in a permanently impaired injured worker sample, and what are the risk factors for poverty in this group? So, I won't belabor, just for the interest of time, everything on my slide here, but we wanted to ask and determine what is the proportion of poverty. We wanted to describe depth and proximity to poverty. How close are people to poverty if they're at the poverty line or below, and how close are they if they're above the poverty line? In other words, the risk of poverty. And we want to be able to say something about what distinguishes injured worker claimants with permanent impairments who are in poverty after their injuries from those who aren't. And then we didn't have a match sample, unfortunately. It's wonderful in the data Emil talked about, but we did make reference in comparison to published estimates of poverty in working age populations that match the population, generally speaking, that we have. So the sample we're talking about is the Research Action Alliance on the Consequence of Work Injury. I think we call it a health and healthcare utilization survey. Our primary focus is really on health in this survey. And these were people who were first-time, single-time, English fluent WSIB claimants between the ages of 25 and 55. Their injuries occurred between January 2002 to November 2007, and they had been designated having a permanent impairment and allocated a non-economic loss award by the board. So that's a board decision. And the ascertaining that a claimant has a permanent impairment takes a bit of time. So we didn't recruit people into this sample just at the moment of injury and filing a claim, but after it had been established that they had a permanent impairment. All the participants in this study are voluntary participants, but we don't have a random sample, but we made a lot of effort to get a really varied sample of permanent impairment claimants who fell into this period. And the Worker Compensation Board was very helpful. The research branch was very helpful in identifying the sample and contacting sample members to indicate their eligibility and entitlement to be in this study. That was not being conducted by them, but by our external group. And so we can talk about the sample later. It is an important issue to talk about, especially relative to the data that Emil describes that comes from administrative files. So in our sample, we did talk to people. Well, actually, we didn't. The York University Institute of Social Research talked to people and collected the data. And we recruited people to the sample, asking them to agree to be in our database for an indefinite period of time. So from time to time, we're in touch with them and following up with some of those individuals. Becky Casey collected qualitative interview data with some of the people from this sample. And Nikki Varma is a student here from Trent University today who's just beginning to take a little foray into the world of injured worker research, and she's going to be contacting some of the sample members as well. So they are real people to us, and we asked a lot of information about what happened to them at the point they were injured, and over time, on average we talked to them on average about 52 months, 4 years and a little bit after they were injured. So we have a lot of information about those trajectories after time. Yeah.
I just have a clarification question.
Yeah.
So in terms of the permanent impairments, would these workers have, what percentage of, did you sort of look at, because, somebody who has, let's say, has been told that they have a 10% permanent impairment would probably be quite different than somebody who has 60%. So just wondering.
I'm going to show some data that shows impairment rating. That's an interesting question. And one of the things I learned about, and we always learn about after we decide this is what we're going to do in a survey, is what we forgot to ask. And what I have from people is information about what the board declared their impairment rating to be. For some who remembered, and a large proportion didn't remember, we believe because their rating didn't make sense to the way they're living their lives. So we don't have complete data on that, and I wish we'd asked them at the time of recruitment if the board could give us the impairment rating, because the board knows that it's in their files, and ask them what they think their impairment rating is. That's a whole other topic. Okay, so we were interested, and I'm presenting here an analysis on poverty. I won't go into a lot of detail about how we measure poverty. I have, in the initial analyses, we distinguish between the low-income cutoffs and the LIM, the low-income measure, which is the measure of poverty that Emil used in his study. These are both relative measures of poverty. That means that the poverty rate, the line, the income point at which you would be above or below or at poverty, depends on information about the rest of the population and their earning power. So the LICO, for example, represents thresholds where a family spending 20% or more of their total income than the average Canadian family on the necessities of life is determined to be. Stats Canada actually won't use the word poverty. They say that that family would be in straitened circumstances. We call it poverty. LICOs then are based on an income measure and relative difference between the average needs for basic necessities of the average family and having some amount below that, and that varies year by year, and the actual dollar numbers change year by year. So that's the low-income cutoff. The low-income measure, as Emil mentioned, is a fixed percentage of the median household income. That is the point at which, or for people who fall below the midpoint, if you were to rank order all of us in a room on our incomes, the midpoint would be the point at which you would be determined to be at or below poverty if you were 50%. At that point of being 50% or below a population in general. The other important thing, so most of the presentation here is based on the LIM, the low income measure, and not the LICO, but initially I'll present both indicators because we find quite different rates of poverty depending on which measure you use. Poverty is a really difficult concept to measure. There are other measures as well. It's very political, of course, how we measure and what we determine to be the meaning of poverty. So I'm going to show a couple here. The other thing that Emil alluded to is that the LIMs and LICOs are calculated to be based on before tax or after tax income. And our question in the RACWI survey asked people about their income before taxes. So I'm using the LIM and LICO BT, before tax, not after tax. Now some estimates have been done that there's a difference, that before tax estimates of poverty overestimate poverty by some proportion, and in one study it was estimated to be about 5% difference, higher rates of poverty for people's estimated poverty levels based on before tax rather than after tax. Okay, so we have before tax income. So we'll keep that in mind when we look at the numbers. So these are the numbers, the poverty estimates that we found in the RACWI survey. So for the LICO BT, the low income cutoff before tax, we calculated a rate of poverty in the sample of injured workers of 17.3%. That includes 80 workers in the study and 196 additional family members in poverty. And we wanted to emphasize that because these are household levels of poverty, not individual poverty. And all of those 80 workers whose family income is indicates being at or under the poverty line live in families, and there's a lot of other people implicated in the loss of earning of one worker in family. The LIM before tax estimate is quite a bit higher than the LICO. So we said the LICO was 17.3%. In our sample, the LIM estimate of poverty in this sample is 25.7%. That's 119 workers in the study and 275 family members in addition. That's a lot of people implicated in households with poverty in this study. So we thought it was important to emphasize, and in our discussion in the article we talk about the fact that poverty happens to families and communities as well, not just to individuals. So I'm just going to give you some comparisons on this slide of published rates of poverty in other studies, and the references are in our paper. So we estimated a rate of 17.3% for LICO poverty. Becky Casey had access at McMaster University Research Data Center to the Canadian Community Health Survey. She estimated in a kind of quick calculation rates of poverty for Ontario using the 2009-10 Canadian Community Health Survey, and for working age people she calculated a rate of 11.4% LICO before tax poverty level, compared to our 17.3% level in our sample. And then the second set of percentages there are Statistics Canada published rates of poverty of 13.4% and 13.6% in 2008 and 2009 respectively. So the dates of these data we collected for the RACWI survey are 2008 and 9 as well. This is for working age population. So we see higher rates in the injured worker population than the average working age population who aren't injured workers, but are families. So this is family poverty rates in published articles. Looking at the LIM, 25.7% estimate of LIM poverty in our study compares to Becky's calculation of 14.1% poverty in the Ontario population a year or so later, Ontario population of working age people, based on the data in the Canadian Community Health Survey that she was able to access. So that's a really big difference. And Poverty-Free Ontario calculated using the LIM AT. We have the LIM before tax. Poverty-Free Ontario's estimate of poverty in Ontario is 13.4% in 2009 compared to our 25.7%. So those are pretty big differences. That can be argued about, how we got the data and who the data came from, because I don't have a random sample of injured workers, and so we can talk about that in our discussion. Now, Emile presented quite a bit of data based on the assumption of the person being a single earner, single person household. And so he talked about what we called here personal poverty. Poverty estimates and based on an individual's single income based on being a single person household. And so we actually wanted to think about how can we understand what predicts which injured workers would fall into poverty after they sustained an injury with a permanent impairment. Because, if 25% are in poverty, that means 75% aren't. And we need to learn a lot from the workers who aren't in poverty about what keeps them out of poverty, even when they have a permanent impairment. So we went to our data, because we could, with the RACWI survey data, and asked questions about what we knew about the workers before they were injured. Because we didn't ask people in this sample, I regret this now, what their household income was prior to their injury, but we did ask them what their personal injury was prior to their injury. So we were able to, assuming that each worker was a single person household, based on their own reported income, determine that about 12.5% of those workers in the pre-injury period were in poverty even when they were employed. And Poverty-Free Ontario tells us that lots of people are at risk of poverty even when they're fully employed. So we can see that in the data. This changes to 27% of workers falling into poverty in the post-injury period. So this is after the injuries based on the LICO indicator of poverty. Okay, so 12% thanks to 27%. We asked the same thing using the LIM. And using the LIM, we determined that 12.3% of the sample in the pre-injury period would have been, if they were living in a single income household, at or below the poverty line. And that increased to almost 40% of people based on the LIM calculator for poverty in the post-injury period. So we know that there's some risk of being in poverty based on what kind of work you're in at the time and prior to you becoming an injured worker. And that to me says we need to be concerned about workers in precarious work for that reason as well. Okay, so what I've done here is I'm trying to give you information slowly on these slides. What we did was create a bit of a rubric here to indicate changes in the workers in this sample's status of being in pre or post poverty before and to the period after their injuries. So what I can tell you from our data is that a proportion of the sample, the RACWI sample, was at and stayed at or below the poverty line after injury. And I put the proportions there depending on which indicator we're using. So 8.4% of the RACWI sample was in poverty, and it stayed in poverty in terms of personal earnings from pre to post injury, 10.3% using the LIM calculator. Okay. We also know that 4.2 or 2.1 using the LICO or the LIM of workers were in poverty and moved out of poverty from pre to post based on the timing of this data. So some people's incomes are supposed to go up, right, with time. So for some proportion of this sample, their incomes pulled them out of poverty, their personal incomes. However, these numbers are the one most concerning. A proportion of workers were not in poverty but fell at or below the poverty line after injury, as indicated here, and that proportion is 18.7% of the sample if we use the LICO measure of poverty, and 29.1% of the sample if we use the LIM measure of poverty. So those were people who were not in poverty when they were injured based on their personal earnings, but fell into poverty based on their reported personal earnings after their injury. And then the bottom line is encouraging, of course, that the majority of the sample were not in and never fell into poverty either before or after the injury. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sense of the consideration we gave to the fact that there's already some marginality or contingency in terms of the earnings and labor market status of workers at the time and before they're injured. We've calculated on this slide the distribution of the sample in these categories of deep poverty, in poverty but above 50% of the poverty line, near poverty, that is they're at or up to 50% above the poverty line, and then people in the other larger earning categories above poverty. And I just give you the numbers here. These are quite different than Emil's numbers. And these are based now back to household income. I've stopped looking at personal earnings, and now I'm looking at the household earnings. And what we see here is that 8.9% of the RACWI sample fell into deep poverty in the post-injury period. That is, that their incomes were not only in poverty, but they were at or below 50% of the poverty line, which is really inadequate income for sustaining yourself and your family. 16.8% were at the poverty line, but above the 50% of the poverty line. And 20.5% were near poverty, so just less than 50, up to or less than 50% of the poverty line in terms of their earnings. Altogether, that's about 46% or so, 20, 46, yeah, 36, yeah, more than 40% of the sample is at or near poverty in this survey of injured workers with permanent impairments. Okay, so I know I don't have too much time, and I have some data here, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about these individuals. 5 minutes, good. Who are in the sample, because we're trying to understand what puts people at risk for poverty, given that the larger majority of this sample of nearly 500 injured workers did not fall into poverty and was not facing poverty. So what we know here, and I show on this slide, is that when we separate people, I've categorized them here as poor, at or below the poverty line, near poor, that is at the poverty line or up to 50% above the poverty line for household income, or non-poor. So all the rest of the slides I'm going to show are comparing those three groups. And what we see here is that on average, the three groups are equal distance from equal length of time since their injuries, an average of about 52 months, just over 4 years since their injury time. So we know, for example, that this proportion who are non-poor aren't non-poor because they're maybe older. They've been out of their injury longer and been able to reestablish their place in the labor market. These are pretty similar numbers here that suggest otherwise. We also know that they're similar in age. So on average, you see that the poor, near poor, and non-poor in this sample were about 45 years old at the time they were interviewed. So it's not like the poor are distinguished from the non-poor in that the poor are really young workers and the non-poor are really old workers. We can't say that here. Here's my slide, Iggy, on percent impairment. What you see in the brackets on each of these categories is the proportion of the sample who were able to tell us what their percent impairment rating was. 62% of the poor, 53% or so of the near poor, and 60% of the non-poor remembered what their percent impairment rating was. Lots of them didn't. I guess it just, these numbers didn't mean anything to them 4 years plus later. And what we learned about that from those who did remember their percent impairment, the average percent impairment reported is pretty similar for these three groups, about 20, around 20%. So 19.5% for the poor, 22% average percent impairment for the near poor, and almost 19% for the non-poor. So it's not like the non-poor are less disabled than, on average. Now, we don't have statistical terms like standard deviation up here. I've kept the details out. But in general, they're similar in that way. Okay, so here I have some information about some of the pre-injury and point of injury experiences of workers. So I will just ask you to look across the slide here that on average, these three groups didn't differ in terms of the reported number of pre-injury health problems and conditions that might have accounted for their earnings, because we're talking about income here. So 2% of each group reported, on average, each group reported having two or so, average of two pre-injury conditions or impairments. So they don't differ in that way. They don't differ very much in terms of the proportion of each group that reported a pre-injury health condition that limited their activity. 7% or so, 7.5% of the poor, 4% of the near poor, and 5% of the non-poor had reported having a pre-existing condition that limited their activity. And what we do see a difference of, indicated by these stars showing a statistical difference between poor and non-poor on this variable, that poor workers, people who became poor in the post-injury period, reporting having sustained multiple injuries at the workplace injury when they were harmed at a greater rate than the non-poor. So 56% of the poor and only 40% of the non-poor reported having sustained multiple injuries when they were injured. So that might count for something about why they're poor as a household in the post-injury period. And the bottom information is about the reported number of post-injury conditions or impairments that are being endured by workers at the time we interviewed them. And these also vary by category. So we see 10.5 on average reported number of post-injury conditions or impairments for the poor, 9 and almost 10 for the near poor, as compared to only about 8 for the non-poor, these are statistical differences, and say something about how the categories differ in terms of health, which might make sense for understanding the experience of the workers who are in and are not in poverty. So my time is up. I might just see if I can sneak on here information about real income dollars, if you'll allow me to do that. And, you know, we can just maybe feel a little enraged about the differences, the gaps in income here. And just remember what we're talking about here, which is about people's income and capacity to earn, you know, to sustain themselves in life. And these are incomes for households, except for this category, which is the average personal, these two categories are the average personal income. So what we see on this slide, and then I'll stop, we can talk about this in our discussion. The average post-injury household income of the poor in this sample is $24,000 compared to $97,000 average household income for the non-poor group. The average post-injury personal income of the poor, $16,000 or so, compared to $43,000 and $500 or so for the non-poor group. The personal income change from pre-injury to post-injury is indicated on this third line. What we see here, this is a negative number, that on average, for people who after their injury fell into the poor group, they report an average income change of a loss of $13,000 per annum for their annual income from pre to post injury, compared to only a $1,900 or $2,000 difference for the non-poor group. That's a big gap. And remember, this is an average, so there'd be real variation. And that's a big loss for people who might have started out with low incomes in the first place. And one more thing that I think is really important is a calculation I have come up with in other research as well, comparing personal income to household income. That shows the contribution of a single person to a household income. We see an absolute difference here between the proportion of household income contributed by people in the poor group compared to the non-poor group. So what we find is the poor, the average worker is contributing 73% of the household income, yet they have tremendously different and lower incomes to contribute, whereas the non-poor group is contributing on average to 46% of the household income, suggesting there's another income earner, and this is what keeps people out of poverty. This would be a key issue that keeps people out of poverty, whereas here we might have workers who are already the primary wage earner in the household, their income's lost, and the whole family falls into poverty. And even now, with the post-injury income, their contribution is absolutely a major part of the income of the household. Okay, so, that's sort of the end of my presentation, and my question at the end is, what are the implications of this kind of information? So what? And really importantly, and what we try to talk about in the discussion in our article is, what's the board's responsibility around this issue, especially when people start out with in poverty, in precarious employment situations? And does the board have, what is the board's responsibility? And I know that people in this room would like to talk about that, so I'd be interested in joining in that discussion. Thank you.